Good morning, and again, apologies for the little problem with my connection here. But I'm very happy to welcome you back to our to our regular sprints. This one is the number 4 virtual meeting beyond GDP 2023. We had a couple of them before what was our summer break here in the global north. I hope you had also a little bit of a break. It's still quite warm in New York. And we definitely have good news for you. We will start the machine very furiously, I may say. So you may need to fasten your seatbelts because we have 3 consecutive weekly meetings planned on this now. So to get back into the swing, I mean, and we had a lot of interested participants in the earlier sprints. There were over 180, which is fantastic. I think it may be a reflection of 2 things. One is that there is an increased interest around the world on this topic. It's definitely a reflection that this is relevant. And second, I think it's also a reflection of the wonderful promotional efforts that our network members are doing. And all of you are now becoming ambassadors. I mean, if you attend and you like what you hear and what you see, please don't be shy to bring this to the attention to colleagues and friends and to other people who may be interested in this topic. And if you have any questions, obviously you can write to us at the network email address NES, Network Economic Statisticians, very simple, at un.org. So today, what are we going today? We will take a closer look at the current state of domestic well-being dashboards around the world. What do they have in common? What are the differences, the idiosyncrasies? And one topic I'm particularly interested in to hear a bit how they are used and actually impact perhaps policy decision makings or perceptions on analysis in general. We are doing a lot of efforts as good statisticians to provide information, so we also want to have the occasional tap on our shoulder to know that this is useful and used and really making a difference. So we were going to look at those dashboards. We're excited to hear about different ones, and there are elements of income and wealth and work and job quality, housing, health, education, environmental quality, and notions of happiness of the population in general. So we will look at the metrics, what is there, how it is presented and brought to the people, and maybe how they are. There is the one or the other effort to bring a variety of indicators together and aggregate them. And we will have a look at data sources being good data management people. Let me just recall also the topic is really on the highest agenda. In fact, I mean, the Secretary General had just, we mentioned this before, our summer break, released a policy brief on this issue of valuing what counts, a framework to progress beyond GDP. So this is being discussed. The proposal therein was to develop just a dashboard exactly like that, and of not more than 10 to 20 indicators. And what I was particularly pleased was that there was also recognition at the highest level that if we do this indeed, we will not just throw this at the universe, but there would, of course, have to be a concerted and well-funded effort around the world if we identify a number of key indicators to build the capacity and enable member states to provide that information. So this is still ongoing in discussions. This is part of the preparations for what we call the Summit of the Future, which will be in the fall of 2024. So you will see some action in that space. We are in the process of putting a high-level expert panel of users and producers together to advise on the framing of such a dashboard. And then, of course, our UN Statistical Commission, where the chief statisticians of all the member states are represented, will have to play a critical role to actually define a set of indicators. So this is ongoing. This is not going to go fast. We all know that this requires reflection, discussions, consultation, calibration. And a good starting point is to look at what is already out there. And that's what we are here to do today. We don't reinvent the wheel. Countries have made experiences, good and bad. So I encourage also the speakers to share those experiences with us. We can only do this because a lot of people work hard in the background. So I thank in particular our colleagues at the UK ONS to prepare this particular session and a sprint in collaboration with our other partners in the Network Bureau, Statistics Canada, the Maldives Bureau of Statistics, Statistics Indonesia, Statistics Netherlands, and the US Bureau of Economic Analysis, and then, of course, my own team in UNSD. There's a lot of brainstorming and preparation and reaching out to experts going on to prepare a session like today. Thanks also to the experts that will connect, because it's only thanks to you that we are having substance and material on the table, and thanks to all of you for connecting. I think we are approaching, I'm just looking up at the corner, the triple digits. So that's very good. So I'm looking forward to these discussions. And as I said, fasten your seatbelt, look out for more. There will be one every week now, starting this September here. So I'm turning now over to Sonia Rezen from Statistics Canada to give us a quick recap of the third meeting. And after that, Eleanor Rees from the UK Office of National Statistics will chair session 2 and give a quick overview of the general agenda. So thanks for connecting. Welcome. And let's all have fun and be inspired by what will be presented. So over to you, Sonia.
Thank you, Stefan. Good morning to all of you. Good afternoon. I'm Sonia Rezen from Statistics Canada. Let me just a second. I'll share my slides. Okay, so last time we've met, it was June 22nd before the summer period. I hope you were all able to enjoy the summer and some time off during that period. The topic of the last sprint session was the role of environmental, social, and governance data within the Beyond GDP lens. We had 6 great speakers. The first one, we were really lucky to welcome him, Richard Barker, who's a member of the International Sustainability Standard Board. The ISSB has just released in June the 2 foundational standards for ESG, which will provide clear guidance to businesses to be able to report on ESG standards. Then it was followed by a session from Vincent Siekering from the OECD. This presentation focused on leveraging the concept of well-being and related metrics to align with ESG concept. During this session, he also shared with us his experience with a pilot employee well-being survey to measure working condition and well-being outcomes. The third session was led by Ellen Slinger from Accounting for Sustainability. This one was really nice as well for an accountant like me anyway. She provided an overview of business accounting community perspective and also highlighted all the tools that her organization have developed to support the transition from a conventional financial reporting to sustainability reporting. Jean-Emmanuel Denève joined us as well from the University of Oxford. We were as well really lucky to have him on board as he's releasing a book or something in the near future, so he was really busy. He presented the work that his team has done for a crowdsourced surveys developed to measure employee experiences at work to calculate their work happiness and the work happiness scores. The results were then linked to financial information and stock market to show a positive correlation of employee well-being to firm value. So this is really innovative in the sphere of ESG. And it was followed by a session from Samir Trabelsi from Brock University here in Canada. He presented the concept of linking GDP with ESG matrix to ensure it is well reported at the country level. But during this presentation, he also highlighted the need for comparability between businesses, but also the need for universal agreed upon standards like the one that the ISSB are currently working on. The last presenter for that session was myself. I presented during that session the experimental ESG dashboard that StatsCan has been working on for the past 2 years, leveraging existing data. There's next steps coming up to develop a benchmarking tool where businesses will be able to input their data into the dashboard and compare themselves with their industries. The objective of my presentation and that session was really to explore the possibility of leveraging either the well-being data to be able to report on ESG, but the opposite as well. So use the ESG data to report on well-being eventually. So there's a need for increased collaboration, and I think there's a spot in there for NSO to be involved in the discussion. So without further ado, I'll leave it to Eleanor to move on with today's agenda in a matter of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. So hello everyone, and I'm really grateful to see you all today, and I'm very much looking forward to today's session. I'm Eleanor Rees from the UK Office for National Statistics, which is our National Statistical Institute. I want to take chair's privileges for 30 seconds just to reiterate what Richard said at the start of the meeting, and we'd be really grateful unless you're asking a question or presenting to keep your microphones muted. It can make it a lot easier for everyone to hear and understand. And I also just want to highlight that we have designated discussion sections in the agenda. So as we go through the presentations, please feel free to put your questions in the chat and I will pick them up once we get there. But also once we're in those discussion sessions, please feel free to raise your hands as well and we'll bring you in. So there are some key questions that I thought was going to be really useful for us to consider and what I was thinking through when we were compiling the agenda for today. And I think it'd be useful for us to consider as we're working through today's sprint. And these questions circulate around: how do we define well-being? Should we be considering well-being now and in the future, and now and in the future and elsewhere? Also, what are all the different purposes of these wellbeing frameworks? Why were they made and who were they made by? How many measures do they have? What do they cover? And do they include both drivers and outcomes? I'd also like us to consider the differences and commonalities between these wellbeing frameworks and also contemplate whether every country's framework should be the same and should there be a one framework for all, or one framework for all either in structure or in measurement. And I think this will open us up to some really interesting conversation as we go through the session. But with no further ado, because I do know the time over there, we are going to start with New Zealand and the Living Standards Framework. And we are very grateful to Marilette and Diana for joining us at what I think is now 11:20 in the evening, when I'm sure you would rather be asleep, because I certainly know I would probably rather be asleep at this time of night. And they're going to share with us the development of New Zealand's Living Standards Framework, including how they define well-being and give focus on their very, I would say, famous wellbeing budget. So over to you.
Dear Eleanor, tēnā koutou katoa, greetings from New Zealand. Thank you very much for the opportunity to join with you today and share our experiences in measuring wellbeing and using it in policy and budgeting. And we particularly welcome the opportunity to hear from the other speakers and learn from the other countries participating today as well. So thank you very much for including us. My name is Diana Cook. I'm the Deputy Chief Economic Advisor at the New Zealand Treasury. But today you get 2 for the price of 1. I'm also joined by my colleague from Stats New Zealand, Maralette Lotta. And so I'm going to briefly introduce you to the New Zealand Treasury's wellbeing frameworks, and then I'll hand you to Maralette to talk about the wellbeing measurement framework developed by Stats New Zealand. And then I'll come back and talk a little bit about the wellbeing budget process in New Zealand. So let me start by just talking a little bit about how we conceptualise and measure wellbeing at the New Zealand Treasury. You may have heard about the New Zealand Treasury's Living Standards Framework, or LSF. So we've been developing this framework for over 10 years. Now, it is broadly based on the OECD's wellbeing framework. So you can see it has wellbeing domains at the top and also stocks of resources which underpin wellbeing, which are there at the bottom of the framework. There are some differences from the OECD approach as the LSF has evolved really to reflect just some of the unique aspects of wellbeing in New Zealand, and particularly around culture and child wellbeing. And we also include an institutions and governance level, which you can see in the middle of the framework there. And that recognises that our current and future wellbeing is really contingent on the health of our institutions. Now, we also increasingly use He Ara Waiora, which is a framework from the perspective of Māori, who are New Zealand's Indigenous population. So we aim actually to use the LSF and He Ara Waiora alongside each other, and also really to draw on other frameworks where appropriate, so taking quite a pluralistic approach, such as frameworks to reflect the views of New Zealand's large Pacific community. So He Ara Waiora was developed by a group of Māori thought experts, and it actually brings a very different perspective to the LSF. Just one example is that while the LSF is centred on human well-being, the natural world is close to the centre of He Ara Waiora, so it's the green circle you can see there called Te Taio. So rather than seeing the environment as a stock of resources to be used or conserved, Māori regard the natural world as a living entity of which humans are a part. So the Treasury has developed a measurement tool as well, the LSF dashboard, to help us understand how New Zealand is performing on the different dimensions of wellbeing. And it assembles around, I think it's around 95 indicators across the 3 levels of the LSF. And where available, it also provides international comparisons and distributional breakdowns across ethnicity, age, gender, and places. So you won't be able to read all of those indicators in the time that I have this slide on the screen, but hopefully you can look through it later and see the different indicators in more detail. We're also working with our Māori Development Agency to develop a similar dashboard of measures for He Ara Waiora, but we don't have that yet. So at this point, just let me pass you to Maralette to discuss Stats New Zealand's wellbeing measurement framework and how it complements the LSF dashboard. Over to you, Maralette.
Thank you, Diana. Kia ora koutou, ko Maralette tōku ingoa. Hello, my name is Maralette Lotta, and I'm a manager at Stats New Zealand. In my role at Stats, I provide oversight to the maintenance of and then the identification of new sources of data for indicators on Ngāti Tohu Aotearoa, also known as Indicators Aotearoa New Zealand. In my part of the presentation today, I will give a brief overview of the aims of Ngāti Tohu Aotearoa, the guiding principles for our suite of indicators, the key dimensions and the key differences between Ngāti Tohu Aotearoa and the Treasury's Living Standards Framework Dashboard. Can you please go to the next slide? Thank you, Diana. So the Stats New Zealand is responsible for identifying gaps in the data that underpins our understanding of wellbeing in New Zealand. So it's partly responsible for that. And Ngāti Tohu Aotearoa is one of the tools that aims to kind of fulfill that responsibility. It's designed as a tool to bring already published data together, and when possible, data will be available and presented with breakdowns of the data along with accessible data downloads. The data is updated as it becomes available instead of having periodic updates of the entire suite of indicators. Our work aims to move beyond an economic view of progress to create an independent picture of progress through a wellbeing and sustainable development lens, to support a wellbeing approach to decision making, to present indicator data in a way that is easy to understand and use for the general public, and to be inclusive in our design and development processes. When selecting and presenting wellbeing indicators and data, Stats New Zealand considers key users of the data, including the Treasury in its wellbeing reporting role. Next slide, please. Thank you. During development, it was decided to keep indicators with no available data on the tool, actually, to illustrate where there are still data gaps in the measurement of wellbeing beyond GDP in New Zealand. When determining whether new data is appropriate to use as an indicator, we look at whether it would be an indicator that is outcome focused and whether it's relevant to New Zealand and incorporates to our Māori, so that's a Māori worldview, and whether the movements are positively or negatively associated with progress. We aim to include objective and subjective indicators, and we have a parsimonious selection process, so we kind of want a balance, so we kind of favour some more simplistic indicators. And we aim that the indicator set provides a broad picture of wellbeing in New Zealand. So the key dimensions, so next slide please, of Ngāti Tohu Aotearoa are general wellbeing, future wellbeing, transboundary impacts and contextual indicators. So I'm not going to go in detail, but I think the slides will be available. And then the next slide, please. So the two measurement frameworks, Ngāti Tohu Aotearoa and the Living Standards Framework Dashboard, have different purposes. So Stats New Zealand's Ngāti Tohu Aotearoa dashboard provides a more comprehensive suite of wellbeing indicators, where the Treasury's Living Standard Frameworks Dashboard provides a narrower range of indicators that the Treasury believes are most important to track, to understand progress in New Zealand and to inform advice on cross-government wellbeing priorities. And Stats New Zealand provides data to the Treasury twice a year for the dashboard as well. Over to you, Diana.
Thank you, Marilette. So now I was just going to talk a little bit about how this type of wellbeing data and evidence is used in policy. And particularly I was asked to talk about wellbeing budgeting, which is one example of how we've been taking a wellbeing approach in New Zealand. But before I turn to that, I thought it might help just to start by providing some of the broader context around the current New Zealand government's wider approach for embedding wellbeing into the policy process. So our Minister of Finance has defined that as meaning moving beyond narrow measures of success and looking at intergenerational outcomes. And the government has been doing a number of things to embed our well-being, a longer term and a more collaborative approach into policy making. So that includes legislative changes, institutional changes, and also changes to decision-making tools, including the budget process. So, of course, underpinning all of this is the development of indicators, measurement, and evidence, which we've both already spoken a little bit about. I would highlight that while the government has asked the Treasury to use both the LSF and He Arawai to support it in its wellbeing approach, at the Treasury, we actually introduced the frameworks to support the quality of our own policy advice, and we see them as non-partisan frameworks that will continue to underpin the quality of our advice over future governments. But let me dive a little bit more into how we have incorporated wellbeing into the budget process. So we've now had 5 wellbeing budgets in New Zealand, and the first was released in 2019. This slide tries to show that our approach has been to actually bring wellbeing into all key stages of the budget process, from setting priorities through to initiative development, right through to the way that the budget documents are presented. But in the interest of time, I thought I'd focus in on a couple of stages and talk a little bit about how wellbeing analysis and evidence was actually being used during the process. So firstly, the strategic phase of the process, wellbeing analysis is a really important part of that process. Under recent amendments to the Public Finance Act, governments are now required to set overall wellbeing objectives, and they shape the upcoming budget. So the approach this government has been taking has been to set more enduring wellbeing objectives, and then it also sets a number of shorter term priorities for each budget, which support progress to the more enduring towards the more enduring wellbeing objectives. So wellbeing data and evidence, including indicators from the LSF dashboard, inform these objectives and priorities. And as a recent example, the Treasury is now required to produce a 4-yearly report on trends in wellbeing and sustainability over time. So the first wellbeing report was published last year, and that informed some changes to the wellbeing objectives in this year's budget, including an increased emphasis on our young people's education and mental health outcomes. So once wellbeing objectives and priorities are set, we move into the initiative development phase. So as part of their spending proposals, agencies are required to identify expected impacts on wellbeing, and they need to use both the Living Standards Framework and He Ara Wai Ora. And they also need to explain how their initiative aligns with the wellbeing objectives that have been set by the government. Now, we see this really as being consistent with traditional policy tools such as cost-benefit analysis. We're really just encouraging agencies to take a broad perspective on what those costs and benefits are. And that includes thinking about unintended impacts or impacts in other sectors, and just to try and quantify those impacts as much as possible. Agencies are also asked to identify impacts on different groups, different population groups. So we've been piloting a gender budgeting pilot over the last couple of budgets, and that analysis was also used to inform budget decisions. And then Treasury provides Cabinet with wellbeing focused advice, both at that individual initiative level, but also on how that aggregate budget package impacts on wellbeing outcomes. And once a budget package is agreed by Cabinet, the public-facing budget documents also bring in a wellbeing focus. For example, the budget documents now include analysis of how budget initiatives impact on children and on women. So that was a pretty high-level introduction to wellbeing measurement analysis and how it's used in the budget in New Zealand, but I hope it gave you a little bit of a taste of the work we are doing. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present today. As Eleanor said, it is a little bit late here in New Zealand, so we might not stay for all the presentations, but we're keen to hold on for a little bit longer. I'm very interested to hear what's been happening in other countries and to learn from the other speakers. Ngā mihi nui, best wishes from New Zealand.
Thank you both so much for that really interesting presentation. And I've put 5 minutes of discussion time in now. If anyone would like to raise any questions, to give you guys the opportunity to dial off early if you needed to. So if anybody has any questions, please feel free to pop any in the chat or raise your hands. I have some whilst people are thinking about it. So oh, do you know what, Aldo? I'll come back with mine. Aldo, feel free to go first.
Oh, thanks a lot. I'm particularly curious to know which are the monetized items and what role is reserved in the planning process for those measures.
Just to check I had the question properly, was the question around to what extent we monitorise? Is that in relation to the CBA process? To what extent we monitorise impacts in a full CBA? We do have a CBA analysis tool, and we're in the process of trying to enrich the values that we have for quantifying and monitorising the impact of a broader range of economic, social and environmental measures. There are constraints around that due to the capability often of agencies and the ability to really quantify impacts. So we don't probably do that as much as we would like, but we really focus on those sort of key steps in CBA: identify, quantify and monitorize, and just getting as far along that spectrum as we can. But we think it's at least a good step if we're identifying impacts as broadly as we can. Even if agencies are not always able to quantify those impacts and monitorise them, and particularly focusing on quantifying and monitorising those bigger and more significant impacts. I hope I understood the question and answered that. Does that make sense?
Fab, thank you, Diana. Richard, I'll take you as our last question to keep us on time.
Thank you. You mentioned something that was really interesting right at the front about retaining variables where you don't have data to retain the logic of the framework and showcase where data development is needed. Has that driven the results you hope to see? Are you seeing data being developed, or is that a longer process that you're working towards?
So we're kind of building, so it's Stats New Zealand that's doing that bit, and we've got a senior advisor that works permanently on the identification of indicators. So he pretty much advises some areas. So one of our Near Water Authority has approached us for advice around how they can develop measurements of water, drinking water quality that would suit our needs as well as the Treasury's to report on. So that's kind of a role we're playing. We're advising on the development of NEO data, and also listening to researchers and what they've done to see if we can get better measurements of stuff, or of wellbeing indicators. So that's kind of from emotional wellbeing all the way through to like fish stock, so environmental wellbeing and things like that. So yeah, we keep the gaps there, and it kind of advises researchers as well where they can work as well. So it kind of gives a bit of guidance for researchers. But yeah.
Might be worth pointing out as well that we do take a different approach for the LSF dashboard, probably reflecting the different purposes of the two measurement frameworks. So because ours is for a policy focus, we're more pragmatic and we use the best indicator we have available, even if it's not perfect, because it's for a policy purpose, and we focus on ones where we can do good international comparisons and distributional breakdowns as well. So it's partly why those two frameworks complement each other, I think.
Yeah, and it's quite likely that we won't be able to fill all the gaps for Ngāti Tohu Aotearoa, because we went out to the public and we had responses from 7-year-olds from school about what they want to know about wellbeing. So I think it'll be pretty difficult to fill in all 109 indicators we've got.
Thank you.
Fab. Okay, thanks guys. So I'm actually the next part of the session. So Richard, I'm going to hand over to you for a second.
Excellent. So just while Eleanor is finding her slides, I'm going to chair this session and mostly just be trying to keep Eleanor to time. So Eleanor, you have 15 minutes. One. I'll give you a signal when you've got a couple of minutes left. Okay.
Yeah, fabulous.
I can see your slides, but they're in full screen now.
Glorious. Okay, thanks everyone. So I've already introduced myself today, but amongst other things I'm responsible for in the UK Office for National Statistics, I'm responsible for our UK measures of national wellbeing, which is one of our beyond GDP tools to measure progress in the UK. Before I start my presentation, I wanted to share with you the well-known and well-cited quote from Robert F. Kennedy during his presidential campaign speech in 1968, which to me highlights firstly the purpose of why we're here today, and secondly the breadth of things that could and potentially should be included in the measurement of a country's progress. He stated that gross domestic product doesn't capture the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry, the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, nor the integrity of our published officials. It measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything, in short, except which makes life worthwhile. So, how have we approached this in the UK? So on the 25th of November 2010, Jill Matheson, our then national statistician, accepted an invitation from our then Prime Minister, David Cameron, to develop a set of national measures of national wellbeing and progress. As a consequence, we launched the Measuring National Wellbeing programme. And Jill stated that she was convinced that the development of these metrics is something that can only be done with an understanding of what matters most to people in this country. Therefore, part of this programme included a national debate where we asked people what things matter most in your life, and people fed in through online surveys, media and events. And it was important to us to make sure we got input from all walks of life. So specifically, we engaged with school children, those who'd retired, parents and vulnerable mothers, young people, religious groups, hospital patients, government departments, charities, academics, university students. And the consultation generated over 34,000 responses. So here are some of the things that people told us back then. Some said that they didn't think that wellbeing was quantifiable, but others highlighted health, wealth, job satisfaction, economic security, having connections, having a partner, our well-being of our family and friends, nice food, books, music, sleep. And I always make this joke, but I'm a mother of 2 small children and sleep is probably the number 1 on my list of well-being drivers. So moving on. So the 34,000 responses highlighted 10 areas of life, which created the structure of our measures of national wellbeing framework. Our 10 areas are personal well-being, our relationships, health, what we do, where we live, personal finance, economy, education and skills, governance and environment. The debate also allowed us to define what we mean by national well-being, which to us is how we are doing as individuals, as community, as a nation, and how sustainable this is for the future. At the time, we had 43 measures which were selected for inclusion, and they aspire to be available for the UK, robust so that they met the statistical standards of accuracy, reliability and validity, comparable internationally, available for a past time series, up to date, be available in the future and capable of disaggregation for specific groups of people and geographical areas. The measures were first presented in a wellbeing wheel, which I've shown here on my screen. However, we had accessibility concerns with this tool as it didn't allow people to see changes over time and also when the measures were last updated. So we moved on to our interactive dashboard. The dashboard allows users to see the latest estimates alongside when they were last updated, track the series over time, link back to the source data, and provides a summary of the data when you hover over an indicator. As you can see, our measures include both subjective and objective measures, and it considers well-being now, for example, our personal well-being, and in the future, considering things like hectares of protected areas of land and sea in the UK. And it also captures well-being, as I've said, of us as individuals, in our communities and us as a nation. Examples of our measures include life satisfaction, proportion of people in unhappy relationships, those who have somebody to rely on if they have a problem, trust, both in government and with each other, job satisfaction and the unemployment rate, accessing our natural environment, belonging to our neighbourhoods, whether you're finding it difficult to get by financially, greenhouse gas emissions and protected areas. And we source all these measures from across either ONS, government or non-government organisations. Impact and successes of our framework over its 13-year existence is wide-reaching, from organisations and departments picking up the framework and using it as a structure to carry out their own impact assessments, through to the ONS 4 personal wellbeing questions, which were established as part of the original programme, being used in the 2015 Airports Commission assessment to inform recommendations around airport expansion. The same questions have also been included and heavily cited in our 2021 HM Treasury Wellbeing Supplementary Guidance of the Green Book. And lastly, the 2022 Levelling Up White Paper, where the ONS4 questions are currently the headline metrics of our Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities experimental Levelling Up mission on wellbeing, where the mission aim is to increase wellbeing in every part of the UK and reduce the gap between the top and bottom areas. Throughout our framework's existence, we've provided either quarterly or 6-monthly updates to the dashboard, with either summary reports or deeper dives into one of the 10 areas of life. During 2020 and 21, the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, we didn't provide updates to the dashboard. We focused on providing both timely picture of wellbeing and a deeper understanding of what and who were driving the changes in wellbeing during this time. Moving us forward to May 2022, ONS took the next step in its Beyond GDP work plan and began publishing climate change insights along GDP. In August 2022, the Measures of National Wellbeing dashboard was added to these, providing the 3 releases representing the 3 pillars of economy, environment and society on the same day to provide a holistic picture of how the UK is faring. Oh, I've gone too fast, bear with me. So, moving on to now. It has been 13 years since we first published the dashboard, and we felt that although there are many key concepts that we included which were still valid, we really wanted to check whether what we collected 10 years ago is still as important to UK in its measurement of wellbeing progress as it was then. So in October 2022, we began a review. So this review was done at pace, but as with the original debate, we wanted to engage with as many people as possible. So we ran a review survey for 10 weeks between October and December last year, and this asked what matters to national wellbeing, but also asked for feedback on our current measures, our title, our outputs, their use and suggestions for the future. Findings from this survey were complemented with additional research from our opinions and lifestyle survey, and it asked people what mattered most to our individual and community wellbeing to around 2,000 people. We also engaged with stakeholders across local, central, devolved and international governments, wellbeing organisations and charities, and asking people for their wellbeing priorities.
Eleanor.
Yeah?
Eleanor, sorry. There's been a request in the chat for you not to speak too fast. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. That's fine. So we asked for their wellbeing priorities and what their wellbeing barriers or enablers are to wellbeing so that we understood their needs. We've also undertaken qualitative research with groups at risk of low wellbeing to ensure we give representation to all in society. Additionally, we have brought together the research on key reviews to date and reviewed 17 domestic and international wellbeing quality of life frameworks. During our review, we also had the support of a technical advisory group of government and non-government organisations, and all of these aspects of our review culminated in our recommendations for change. So what were we told? Overarchingly, the main theme that came out of every bit of research we carried out was the importance of inequality in the measurement of national wellbeing. This was both a demand for additional disaggregations to be provided to identify inequalities and for the inequality metrics themselves to be included. Through our consultation survey, we asked users to comment on the completeness and appropriateness of our measures. We had over 600 comments, and the majority of which had suggestions for new measures or topics for inclusion, and I'll touch upon some of these in our next slide. For both the dashboard and for the measures themselves, the importance of capturing change over time was highlighted. Users wanted it to continue, but for it to be clearer. People wanted the measures to be timely and to be presented more frequently. And there was demand for greater coherence and coverage in the measures. For dissemination, people liked our dashboards, but suggested improvements to, for example, to commentary, to charts, and already mentioned the presentation of change. Lastly, we received comments that we needed to better raise awareness and further promote the existence and use of the dashboard and our measures. So on screen, I'm pleased to share with you the new UK Measures of National Wellbeing Dashboard. This was published as part of a suite of releases on the 5th of July this year. So to try and capture the great demand for additional topics of inclusion in the frameworks, we've increased our measures from 44 to 60. So for us, this involved removing 6 measures from the framework and adding in 22, and they were prioritised for filling conceptual gaps or for the addition of inequality metrics. For more details on these changes, you can see it in our publication, which was called Review of the UK Measures of National Wellbeing. And as I said, it was published on the 5th of July. Our new 60 measures include, examples of our new measures, including either the measures that we've added in or existing measures we continued with, are satisfaction with life, whether we think the things we do in life are worthwhile, again, whether in general we trust people, satisfaction with our healthcare system, time spent on unpaid work, volunteering, feeling safe, gender pay gap, people who are finding it difficult to get by financially, A-level or equivalent qualifications, unemployment rate, inflation, people who feel they don't have a say in what the government does, greenhouse gas emissions, household recycling, and abundance of priority species. The dashboard presents the latest estimate of each measure within each domain, and its time series includes presentation of change and commentary. To aid understanding of change, we present an arrow to show the direction of change with a label on whether this represents improvements or decline. Okay, I'm just about there. We also present the extent of change. You'll also see the source of the measure. The dashboard allows you to filter by whether a measure has increased or declined and what domain it's in. We're continuing to publish quarterly as people preference having a timely update, and to meet more demand for granular estimates, we'll continue to publish our measures broken down by age and sex and region quarterly where possible, but we plan to create a new annual publication which breaks all these measures by further sociodemic and geographic breakdowns on an annual basis, which will start from next autumn. I think I'm probably going to stop there to keep us to time.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ellen.
Sorry, Richard. There's one point I wanted to make, which I think might be important, is that 60 measures can be seen as quite a lot, and especially in the UK, we've had some feedback on that. So we've started a piece of work to explore the use of a smaller set as well. And that was it. That's my last point.
Excellent. I'll quickly do a check for any immediate questions or thoughts. I don't see any, so I will pass back to you, Eleanor, to move us to the next session.
Absolutely. Okay, so our next session, I'm really pleased to introduce Dasho Karma-Irma, who is going to be coming in to speak to us about the Gross National Happiness Index. So Dasho Karma-Irma is the president of the Centre for Bhutan Studies and the Gross National Happiness Research. And I'm happy to hand over whenever you're ready.
Can you hear me?
We can indeed.
Oh, thank you. I have a small problem. I don't know how to share the screen because I've never used Teams.
So there's a bar right across the very top.
You can see that?
Yes, and right next to the red leave button, you should have a share button.
I can also see that open share tray, it says. How do I do that? Open share tray.
So mine just says share, and then I'm able to select which screen I'd like to share.
But then Then I get allow Teams, Micros Teams to observe your screen. I say allow.
I think so, yeah.
But then nothing comes out.
Oh, it's coming up for us now. I can see your screen. Are you able to put your slides on your screen?
Can you see this one? No.
Yeah, the slide pack is coming on screen right now. That's it. Marvelous. So if you maximize that and then pop that into presenter mode, I think we might be there.
Okay. Can you see? I've done that. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay. So I don't. Let's see. Can you see?
Yeah, we can see. We can see.
Thank you very much. So do you see the screen and me both, or just the screen?
We can see you and the screen both, and we're looking at a presentation where the slide says national goals and a single number GNH index at the top.
Thank you so much. Good evening from my geographical position, and you can see behind me the sun going down the hill as it has done for billions of years, and it's very comforting but also not so comforting to think that we are interfering with the fluctuation of its temperature that it provides to us. It's a huge honor for us to listen to all of you who are breaking new grounds. We have been at it for some time, and I should begin by saying I think that Stefan raised many questions, and I also found the presentations of New Zealand and yours presentation, Elena, very, very useful for us. There are many things that are common. We use many different languages and the ways to portray it, but I think the fundamental things we are trying to do seems very similar. I have 15 minutes, isn't it?
Yeah, we've probably got about 11 minutes left.
Oh, okay. So I have 10 minutes. So it was very good. I flashed all those slides because I won't be able to visit them again. In our case, the indicators we produce are both simultaneously from the same data set. We can produce dashboards, many dashboards, and at the same time we can produce indices, composite. And this is made possible by the method that can combine, let us say, qualitative and quantitative apple and oranges because we use a way to segregate anything into a deprived individual with respect to some variable and sufficient person who is sufficient with respect to that individual. So this allows us to sort of dichotomize the data and then go on further with building indicators and index. So the question of sufficiency threshold is rather a interesting proposition from our side, which I didn't notice in the two other presentations. As regards applications, which Stefan raised right at the beginning, this slide presents a little bit of our effort under progress, along with other economic indicators, the GNH single number index, many dashboard indicators that is trying to help very different agencies achieve their goal, benchmark their plan. but also to govern policy making by using the GNH policy screening tools at the cabinet level. And now moving forward to use of GNH project selection tools, and this is a managerial tool, but we have expanded further to sort of support corporation by developing GNH GNH for business certification, by which major companies of the government are certified. One new area in which we are actively engaged at this moment is what it is what are the efforts we should make in terms of infrastructure building to influence or orient the individuals who inhabit it to be successfully happy. And that is the question of city planning through GNH mechanism. So this is what we are doing. This one shows what we do when we apply a different set of criteria to businesses. So, but other than that, of course, GNH is studied in colleges and education in an effort to also make them cultivate some sort of consciousness about broader things in their life. But I think I should focus a little more on the not on this sort of thing, but on the aggregation method, which might be more relevant for us to share. We are not constrained so much by data because ours is based on survey-based, which is conducted every 4 to 5 years. The reason for this 5-yearly interval is because the socio-economic development plan of Bhutan is formulated once every 5 years. So, ours is periodic, not so continuous and dynamic like the UK one. So just to show a little bit about the index calculation method, really this is, gather data every 5 years, and that is a very expensive and a long process lasting about 6 months of survey in the field based on structured questionnaires. But there are also several open-ended questions. Then calculate the score of each individual to see whether they are attaining that particular variable or they are deprived in that. And then use the aggregation method to find who is happy or who is not happy. There are 4 categories in the gradient of happiness, and then use that to compute GNH, which is index, which is essentially based on really three numbers. First number, how many people are qualified as happy because they have attained X percentage of sufficiency in X percentage of variables, and then also calculate the number of individuals who are unhappy in a similar way. And the third variable we need is also the average sufficiency of those unhappy people. So percentage of happy people plus percentage of unhappy people into percentage of sufficiency attained by unhappy people. So that would give a number which should be between 0 and 1, and currently it is 0.70 or something. So
not to interrupt, we've got about 4 minutes.
So you can see this formula. Can you see this?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Right. So essentially, this is the aggregation method. I think this is there is a slight difference in how we are approaching this from the way you are doing, which is dashboard. But we equally produce many dashboards which are disaggregated. The advantage of the formula which we are using as Alkire-Foster methodology of aggregation, as I said before, is that you can break down the index to nth level of variables and the nth level of individuals. So it's very useful for targeting policy purpose, which is after all the reason why we are trying to do this kind of thing. It can be broken down at geographic level, at sectional level, at the level of education, any kind of demographic variables. Overall, you can see that there has been moderate improvement over the years since we started measuring GNH in this way. Sort of people who are in the desperately unhappy category are moving up to the narrowly happy, which is the normal sort of human condition. It seems edginess, not stable and permanent. And then narrowly happy group moving up over time into the extensively happy one, where the ranges of variables that they enjoy sufficiency are much broader, meaning that you can pull and diversify, and the risk of being unhappy, unwell, are much lower. And then those other final group, which are sort of very robustly happy, and that's about 9%, 10% now. So in short, really, this is my presentation, and I can stop for a discussion. How am I doing with time?
1 minute left.
Okay, 1 minute last. So this is, I'm trying to show some picture of survey, which looks a bit like adventure tourism, but it's a face-to-face survey, and we take about 11,000 households in the country out of 160,000 households. I think Stefan mentioned about sharing bad and good experiences too at this time. Although these sort of measures have been applied in the country, we have not been able to unify the national accounts statistics with the GNHS statistics, and one of the key decision-making units in our country, the Ministry of Finance, leans heavily on the normal statistics of macroeconomic management, and this tends to really sometimes overshadow the direction the government taking, especially since COVID. There is a slight trend in that direction. So I will stop here.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. That was really interesting. I'm going to move us on to Carrie's presentation from Canada, and then we'll come back for a 15-minute discussion to take questions from across the three presentations, including my own and Dasho Kara Irma's and Carrie's right at the end. So I'm now, as I said, going to hand over to Carrie Wolanski, who is the Director for Social Data Insights and Innovation in Stats Canada. and Carrie's going to share with us an overview of Canada's Quality of Life Framework, which was released in 2021, and I hope I've got that right. And Carrie will also discuss their role in the Wellbeing Economy Government's partnership.
Hello, lovely to be here. Can you hear me? Can you see the slides? Is everything working?
Yes, yeah, can see the
Perfect.
slides,
Good,
can
good.
hear you, marvelous.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Really interesting to go after that last presentation, just because I think you've done a really good job of reminding us of a time horizon that's longer than the moment, and I always appreciate that. In terms of the two presentations before, our work, and actually all three before, is really explicitly inspired by those, and so just I think we're a newer kid on the block. So let's talk about where we're at now. But I did want to situate us. It's really easy, I've found, for me at least, to kind of think about this as a conceptual model and present the conceptual model, and not always anchor it in sort of how things are going right now in terms of well-being trends. So I wanted to signal that it's a disruptive time out there. We have this suite of metrics to understand social change, but I'm not convinced we fully understand the disruption of the COVID pandemic and whatever has come after yet. I think it's a historic disjuncture for at least us in Canada, and I'm sure many others. And it's had impacts on our social structures and cohesion that we're still making sense of. We have other challenges, misinformation in our context, confidence in institutions, mental health, rising crime, et cetera. It's a complex time. Economically, we're kind of turning the corner. We had the first quarter of contraction here just recently in terms of GDP. We have cost of living challenges. There's a lot of pressures around housing. We've had a very large immigration very recently in order to kind of help us navigate the post-COVID period, but that has, flow-on impacts. And lots of concerns about wealth inequalities, sometimes related to housing. And we've had a terrible wildfire summer here, just shocking and astounding. We had a whole city that was evacuated. Multiple parts of the country, which is very large, have been affected. And there's a number of other disasters, wind events, floods, et cetera, that are really bring home climate change to our doorstep. So in that context, I think, part of the reason for this beyond GDP conversation at the moment, it has an increased currency, is that decision makers are looking for tools to address this complexity and deal with multi-dimensional trade-offs. Also, just to signal that there's a lot of multilateral organizations, a lot of governments at different sub-regional levels, and national governments that are grappling with these issues at the moment. So perhaps a good opportunity for convergence. In terms of Canada's framework, it was released, it was developed at an interesting time, which was, it originated from a mandate letter commitment from the Prime Minister to the then Minister of Middle Class Prosperity and Associate Minister of Finance. And I'll just pause to say that at the time, I actually worked at the Department of Finance, so I have kind of two hats. I was the director responsible for the policy end of standing up this framework, and now I'm the director responsible for the statistics program that ensued. And so at the time that the mandate letter commitment was developed, it was very explicitly referencing the New Zealand Wellbeing Budgeting Model tied to the budgeting process. And it was COVID that we actually were called upon to give shape to this thing. And so that very much influenced the tone and flavor of how we were thinking about these issues. In particular, we did some public opinion research, and it was August 2020, and there was just this moment of time. So we didn't do quite as extensive engagement processes as the UK and New Zealand and Bhutan have described. We did sort of a more narrow and quick version in terms of getting the pulse of what people were thinking at the time in terms of what that disruption meant for their lives. It was really interesting conversations about more time at home with their families and more access to green space, and it felt like a disruptive kind of moment where people were really considering also distributional questions about access to water, which is an issue for us in First Nations communities and in the North. That sort of thing. Broadly, those distributional considerations were coming up as well. So it was a moment in time where people were kind of ripe to reflect on what makes for a good quality of life, and and that did influence our thinking. But it also happened in the context of this larger international convergence around themes. So the themes that we had called out were quality of life or well-being. So this holistic, multidimensional kind of frame, inclusion, equality, distributional considerations, and sustainability. And for us, when we're talking about sustainability, we're not just talking about environmental concerns. We're talking about health promotion over the life course. We're talking about human capital development. We're talking about social cohesion, and so we've reflected that in the design of our framework. Just a quick nod to our process to signal some of the things that are important in the Canadian context. It's a whole of government effort, which matters, I think, in terms of this conversation, in terms of the alignment with different frameworks. So there's a lot of different frameworks in play in the Government of Canada, and we did a big exercise to map the indicators underneath those frameworks. So we'd be joining the dots at the indicator level, if not at the sort of narrative overarching framework level. And we have a federated, highly federated system here in Canada. And so it's unusual in my experience with the federal government, for the federal government to sort of identify progress measures where it doesn't control all of the levers. This is a different sort of exercise in that regard. It isn't, here's our list of indicators and we're going to stack up an intervention against each of those. It's a monitoring framework to look at broadly what trends do we think matter for human well-being, how do we monitor those, and then how can we use that to identify policy priorities. So that could be, an area of policy where we were doing well and now aren't. It could be one where we've been lagging historically in an international context for years. It could be one where most people are doing well, but there's a really big distributional difference in terms of that outcome. Speaking of distributional differences, I've acknowledged the Indigenous landscape in Canada is really pivotal to our history, our context, and our contemporary renegotiation in the context of conversation very actively about reconciliation and self-determination. And so navigating that space, unlike the New Zealand model where they have a Indigenous component, we have a sort of carve out for Indigenous data development and leadership, reflecting the diversity of cultures and the push towards self-determination, including data sovereignty. And so that part of our framework remains a work in progress, how we crosswalk between Indigenous-led and co-developed frameworks, of which there are multiple ones under development. And we're very much grounded in the evidence base around subjective well-being and its determinants. That's sort of an underpinning frame for our model. This is our wheel. Our wheel has 5 domains. It's not dissimilar from other frameworks and very much, as I said, explicitly inspired by many of them. I think the thing that we were aiming for here was simplicity in terms of aggregating some of those multiple domains so that there would be sort of a simple across the top narrative. So we have prosperity, which includes distributional differences, housing, and skills. We have health, which includes mental health as well as sort of our care systems. And we have society, which includes things like time use and sort of cultural characteristics that matter in Canada, official languages, Indigenous languages, that sort of thing, culture, and governance, which includes, trust in institutions, crime safety, personal safety, that sort of thing, and environment, which includes some environmental measures of, say, GHG emissions, et cetera, but also things like air quality, satisfaction with green space, walkable communities, that sort of thing. I've listed on the left side, you can see our 20 headline indicators. We have 84 in the framework. So many of these headline indicators in particular existed previously. They're not new measures with, an important exception, which is the sense of meaning and purpose. We weren't measuring that previously. Thanks to the UK for designing a great definition that we could lift of international apologies. We also have 2 cross-cutting lenses. One of those lenses called the fairness and inclusion lens. And the idea there is to look at distributional differences in all of the indicators and domains in the framework. And the other is the sustainability and resilience lens. And that lens is also intended to look at sustainability, risk, resilience considerations, the trajectory we're on, and whether it's a healthy one from a long-term perspective for all of the domains and indicators as relevant in the framework. A shout out to my team that did a bunch of work to look across different frameworks to try to kind of look at how comparable some of our indicators were. I haven't included all of that analysis here, but I have included some highlights, which were, as I've mentioned, the explicit extent to which we were inspired by some of these models, the similar themes and domains, even though the grouping is sometimes differently. There's often a common language, and indicator definitions are often used, which is important from our perspective and deliberate in terms of international benchmarking, so we can see how we're doing in an international context. And also our commonalities are influenced by our collective efforts around the SDGs, and also for those of us who are connected to the OECD Better Life Initiative. I think that drives some convergence in areas of commonality. Also, we like our cross-cutting lenses, but signal that this sort of distributional considerations is often a common ingredient in these frameworks, and also the long-term and risk resilience elements. I'm going to turn a moment to how we use this in the policy cycle. Part of this is the beautiful dream, and part of it is actually in place. Our goal is that the quality of life framework is a common taxonomy for sort of benefits and trade-offs, negative, positive impacts from policy measures that are proposed, and that it's considered at all stages of the policy development process. So that there's an evidence base that's shared that feeds into the policy, into the budget development cycle at the outset of each year or each budget cycle, which is about now. And now already we have baked into the template that every department that is asking for funding needs to articulate the benefits and negative impacts, trade-offs of their proposal in the language of the quality of life indicators and its framework. We're also working towards greater integration to other stages of the policy process. The lead for this initiative shifted it to the Treasury Board Secretariat, which runs our sort of release of funding for program approvals process, as well as our results measurement. So that's the space that's most active now. And they also have an important role in implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. And so the goal is to have sort of this pipeline linked through the policy evaluation sort of cycle so that you're using these metrics. Now, importantly, not every initiative is going to touch the level of these metrics. You can't always identify a specific contribution that your initiative made to sense of meaning and purpose, from a modeling perspective necessarily, but you can ask qualitative evaluation questions. For example, did this improve? So we have elements of our framework that are really about. Sorry, is that a question?
No, I just a little reminder for people to be on mute if they're not presenting.
All right. So basically, we have made substantial progress into hardwiring this into the budget cycle, and we're still working on other phases of the policy process. But the idea is that we have this monitoring set of indicators that we measure at a high level, and then we're looking at which initiatives we have that contribute to those. And essentially, we're sort of trying to push the value proposition of our measures up the intervention logic towards the ultimate outcomes. So, push towards measures that really contribute to those higher level outcomes where possible. In terms of shifting now to the Quality of Life Statistics Program, Budget 2021 had funding that sort of grouped into two areas. One was a hub. We've developed a hub. It was launched in March 2021. It's a work. I really like the simplicity of it, simple, intuitive logic. But we're working towards more interactive functionality over time, that sort of thing. But basically, it follows the logic of the quality of life framework. There's a page for each of the indicators. It groups together the most recent and also past, releases around that data point, as well as studies, analytical pieces, that sort of thing. And it is really partly about the user experience. We are also working on filling data gaps. So we have a budget that we typically use to purchase data in the new Omnibus survey that Statistics Canada launched during the pandemic. So it's a quarterly vehicle. Many of the measures in our framework already existed and have a sort of a good, historical trend. So say poverty or GHG emissions, those existed before the quality of life framework, and we're just bringing those together. But we do collect new data and consciously address data gaps, and there's sort of different types. So it could be data we're not collecting. So we included measures for which we weren't already collecting in the framework, for which we weren't already collecting data, as I mentioned. Sense of meaning and purpose is an example. And it could also be that we're collecting it, but not for sort of harder to reach populations. So now we're more conscious about sort of filling in those data gaps for those groups. It could be that it's something that we collected, say, in our general social survey once every 5 years, but now we have a more frequent interval that gives us a sort of a more of a pulse check on how things are moving. And it could be that it's collected but not disseminated. And so, so we're paying attention to that as well. So I already sort of telegraphed a little bit of, what's different as a result of the framework, but it is this sort of, yeah.
Sorry,
Yep, no problem.
1 or 2 minutes left,
Perfect.
if that's okay.
Second last slide. So it gives us this conceptual framework to sort of organize our thinking and our work. As I mentioned, we're collecting some new data. We also have this harmonized set of indicators that enables us to target more consciously where our data gaps are and in what order of sort of sequence of priority. There's also an important concurrent investment in more granular data through our disaggregated data action plan. I mentioned we're collecting stuff more frequently, and as a result, we get insights. For example, one of the things that we're seeing is how the trend in subjective experience of difficulty in meeting financial needs related to movements in inflation. And we see a particular pinch point in the fourth quarter of 2022. And interestingly, because our data now lives in this integrated ecosystem, we could also see movements in other quality of life indicators in that same quarter. So sense of belonging to local community, future outlook, et cetera, alongside difficulty meeting financial needs. So we're getting sort of new information from this greater frequency that I think, speaks to, what we're trying to do here, which is to generate insights that are relevant, policy relevant for decision makers and relevant to other sectors of society informing their decisions. This is a bit of a sort of a thought bubble of where it is, maybe what isn't in the framework yet or where we're hoping to go or it's there, but we haven't fully operationalized it. We'd like to be more consistent with our time series that we're building around the quality of life indicators. We have a bit of a dance that we have to do between addressing new data gaps for our indicators versus building our time series. So that's something we're looking at how to resolve. We have a project called Unlocking the Data, which is really about how we organize our data. We have a history of these surveys that have evolved separate populations, et cetera, and they aren't speaking the same language in terms of the group level breakdowns. So we want to be able to organize our group level breakdowns more consistently for the dissemination of data. So you can easily pop out, say, for example, how is quality of life across multiple outcomes for Black people in Canada vis-a-vis other Canadians, et cetera. So this is a sort of standard group level geographical classifications to organize kind of Lego blocks. So we have standard indicators versus standard subgroups, breakdowns versus, groups, and then time series that's more consideration. More consistent. We're also working on, teasing out now that we have these new tools, what's the value proposition, what insights are coming out of that, and how do we bring people along in understanding that new landscape? And working, including through multilateral processes to consist, such as the UN fronts of the Chair of Social and Demographic Statistics, and also hopefully with the OECD around the kind of more complex dynamics and conceptual underpinnings. So right now we have a list of indicators. That indicator set includes things that are determinants. It includes things that are sort of equity-based for specific population. It includes things that are outcomes that could be correlated. And so we'd like to do some work. Also, there's sort of the idea of sort of individuals, communities, families. So we'd like to keep thinking conceptually about sort of how those pieces fit together in terms of the relationships so that we're telling a more holistic story. So I will wrap there. Thanks for your time.
Amazing. Thank you very much. We've got about 9-10 minutes now for discussion to try and keep us on track. And whilst people are thinking to put their hands up, I'm going to go through the chat box. We've had a few questions come in as we were discussing. So the one I'm going to ask first of all is from Aldo, and this is to Dasho Kama, which is, how is the sufficiency score defined and calculated?
Can you hear me?
I can, thank you.
Right. And all the variables used go through this first level cutoff, that is sufficiency. And these sufficiency levels are drawn either from, not either, these are drawn sometimes from group focus discussion, sometimes from existing conventions, and at other times from existing laws. What should be the minimum that a person should have? But some other things, such as intangible things, such as the level of emotions, positive emotions, which you should have had over the last 2 weeks, are drawn from existing literature or some Buddhist orientation, for example. So my short answer is that I should add that one small variation in GNH seems to be its emphasis on interior life or the emotional life of the people, as well as the high emphasis placed on sociality or community relationship. That seems to be also a little bit of emphasis in the GNH. I stop here.
Whilst we have you, the second question came in, which queried the 7-year gap rather than the 5-year gap between 2015 and 22. I assume that was the impact of COVID, but I'll let you come in if there was a different answer.
Yes, the COVID seems to have affected certain variables, certain domains more than the others. It hasn't affected things like environment. Of course, it has improved, but it has, I think, impacted the domain of health. It has impacted the domain of psychology. It has also, it has also affected some part of culture, but in other parts of culture, such as solidarity and cooperations, it has actually improved because, because it has forced people. But I didn't get the real sharp side of your question. What has the COVID done? What was the question?
The question was just to try and understand how in your presentation you mentioned that you updated every 5 years, but it was a 7-year gap between 2015 and 2022.
Oh, yes, that was because we had to postpone the survey because there was very restrictive rules about movement, prolonged lockdown in this country to do these kind of things which might spread infection. But the good side was that probably per 1,000 people, not per 1,000 people, the life lost was about 5 or 6 in this country due to COVID.
Fab, thank you. So we have some other questions that are coming in on the chat. And one of the questions comes into both Carrie and myself, which is asking about how we manage to specifically trace the impact on and the situation of migrants. So I know from our perspective, we're very mindful that they're not always included in all our data collections being household surveys. But one of the things that I wanted to raise from an ONS perspective is that we are carrying out, I believe, some qualitative research with these groups. It's not been undertaken by my area, but it's an area that we work quite closely with. So we'd be considering lived experiences and impacts on their lives through qualitative research, through focus groups and one-to-one interviews and things like that. Carrie, I'll bring you in at this point as well.
Sure. We have different data sources in play. We do split sort of the new data we're collecting specifically through this quality of life funding in the Canadian Social Survey. We do have it by immigrant status, non-immigrants, immigrants, and non-permanent residents. There's in some of our data sets, we have a richer picture of sort of the tenure, how long people have been in Canada, second generation, in particular, for example, outcomes around education and incomes. We have quite an established data infrastructure for those populations. Immigration is really a critical part of sort of Canada's culture and strategy. And so you can see the sort of depth of the analytical infrastructure around it. My cat is some.
Thanks, Carrie. So on the note that Carrie made, on our household surveys in the UK, we do hold the same information regarding migratory status on, for example, our annual population survey. So you are able to identify those in the survey who've recently migrated, who may not, and if they have dual nationalities. And we've also been undertaking studies with recent Ukrainian migrants into the United Kingdom, and included in those surveys, I believe, are questions on their subjective personal well-being. We have more questions coming in. We have one here from Evo, which says, for international purposes, is there a preference for quality of life versus well-being dashboards? And what is the difference, if any? I have a stance on that, but I don't want to take too much of Chair's privilege. So I wonder if anybody else would like to come in first, or... Go on, Carrie.
I don't know about a preference, but I can say that that was one of the questions that we included in our public opinion research question in developing the framing, and you can see what landed on top.
Fab. From my personal perspective, I personally don't feel that there's any difference between a quality of life and a well-being dashboard, and then their words used quite interchangeably. I think it's more around organisation and domestic preference. And in the UK, in the organisation and how I use it myself, you'll note I'm the head of the quality of life team responsible for the measures of national wellbeing. So you can see we use them quite interchangeably just at an organisational level. But I also use the term, and some colleagues like it, some colleagues don't, where I reference what I call big wellbeing and little wellbeing. Now, this isn't to undermine the value of it, but it's for people to conceptually understand that we have personal subjective well-being as an element of our wider well-being, which would also account for health, our employment, our communities that we live in, our relationships that we have. And I like to try and see this as our outcome variable and our understanding of how our self defining how we're doing. Are we flourishing against our standards effectively, but then how that fits in against our wider well-being? So to me, the words are interchangeable and it's a preference. Not to preempt any additional conversation that will happen afterwards, but I wonder whether Carrie Exton from the OECD would have the same thoughts through the research that they've been doing more recently. I appreciate there are more questions there, and as the presentations go on, I will do my best to add the right people in to help us get them answered, but we are 10 minutes behind, so I'm going to try and keep us as up to date as we can, and I'm going to end the discussion session there for a second, and I'm going to move us on to Carrie Exton. So Carrie is a Deputy Director at the Wellbeing, Inclusion, Sustainability and Equal Opportunity, so commonly referred to as WISE Centre at OECD, and she'll be discussing a little bit of the Better Life framework and index, but more so the research they've recently carried out into common contexts of wellbeing frameworks.
Thanks very much, Eleanor. Just checking with everybody that the slides are there and you hear me okay.
Absolutely fantastic.
Great. I'm very aware that time is short, so I'm going to jump straight in, but it is great to be here. And hello, everybody. So I start with the conceptual framework that underpins the OECD's work. Not to say that this is the only way to do this, but simply to define my terms and be clear what the OECD means when we use the word well-being. It's clear that the terminology discussion is very live today, and I think that's very useful. So this framework was developed in 2011. And it was shaped by many different influences. So that includes the academic literature that already existed well before 2011, the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi report in 2009, as well as pioneering work across many countries from the early 2000s onwards. So this is really, in a way, a kind of consensus-based approach, drawing on all of those different influences. We have been revising our indicator set and our framework over time to reflect the latest developments across OECD countries in particular. And we did a major review in 2019. So what you see here is the very slightly updated 2020 edition of our framework. And just to highlight a few key features, there are three main pillars here. We have current well-being on the top left, we have inclusion on the top right, and then we have sustainability underpinning the framework down at the bottom. So in current well-being, we consider people's material conditions, so things like income, work and job quality, housing. We have a set of domains that we call quality of life. So here's a confusion already, because under quality of life, and this is following the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi recommendations, we have things like health, knowledge and skills, the quality of the environment, people's subjective well-being. We also have relational well-being in here, so domains such as social connectedness, civic engagement, capturing aspects of how we live together. So on the right-hand side, you can see a central feature of our well-being approach is to go beyond averages. So when we're reporting on well-being, we of course look at national averages, but we also consider several facets of inclusion. So from inequalities between groups to overall measures of dispersion, so the gap between people at the top and people at the bottom of the distribution, as well as deprivations. And we do this right across our current well-being outcomes, not only for income and wealth, the sort of classic inequality measures that the OECD has been producing for many decades. So underpinning all of this, as I said, is sustainability. And here we consider 4 different resources for future well-being in terms of natural, human, economic, and social capital. And here we try and look at stocks where we can, but more often we're looking at things like flows, risk factors, and also resilience. So if you want to see the types of indicators that we use to illustrate this conceptual framework, the best place to look is our OECD How's Life Wellbeing database. And this is a publicly available resource of more than 80 indicators covering OECD and selected partner countries where we try and go beyond OECD, and with a time series back to 2004, wherever possible. And if you like pictures and text to go with your numbers, then I strongly recommend the How's Life series of reports, which document trends in well-being, inclusion and sustainability over time in OECD countries. As you can see on this slide, we also did a report in 2021 looking at well-being patterns during COVID-19. And we produce regularly updated country profiles with around 8 to 10 pages of country-specific findings across our internet for all OECD countries. Finally, we have a website called the Better Life Index, where you can play around with a subset of our indicators and actually build your own index of well-being to see how countries perform on the dimensions of life that matter most to you. So there is no official OECD index of well-being. We very much, like the other countries that have presented so far, mainly focus on a dashboard approach, but we have created a website where you can build your own index according to the weights that you would assign against our current well-being outcomes. So that's really sort of a tool for helping people to explore the data. We don't have time to go through all 80 indicators today, but I wanted to illustrate some of the types of data that we work with in the OECD. And of course, this is driven by the availability of comparable data across countries. So, you know, within domestic national dashboards, there's very often a much richer set of information that can be used. We are quite limited to the things that can be measured on an international basis, but we can still do a pretty good job in most cases. So this wheel summarizes a few headline indicators of current well-being, and those are the solid bars that you can see. And we also have some headline indicators of inclusion, which are the dashed bars. And this wheel is looking in particular at Finland, and it is comparing how Finland is performing relative to other OECD countries. And basically, the longer the bar, the better the well-being. So as you can see, the goal here is to provide a holistic picture of current well-being in the country, so in this case, Finland. And like all OECD countries, Finland has strengths and weaknesses across current well-being outcomes. So we can see, for example, housing affordability, gender gaps in feelings of safety, time spent on social interactions, and voter turnout are areas where Finland is slightly below or quite far below the OECD kind of average. And by contrast, Finland has some of the highest levels of things like access to green space in the OECD, some of the lowest levels of outdoor air pollution, and some strong outcomes in things like knowledge and skills. Again, we have a headline indicator set for the 4 capitals, and what you see here is just really a small subset of the number of indicators in our overall database. And again, like all OECD countries, Finland has some areas of strength and some areas of weakness. And some indicators have positive trends, while other indicators are worsening over time. So, for example, Finland's material footprint and household debt levels are among the bottom third of the OECD, and they are getting worse over time. By premature mortality is an area of mid-ranking performance in the OECD, and that's improving over time. Knowing that the focus of today's event was very much on domestic indicator dashboards, I didn't want to spend too long describing the OECD measurement approach. There is lots more information available on that online. And again, I think the slides will be shared with everybody. So the rest of my slide deck really summarizes some work we've been doing to look at approaches across OECD countries, both in terms of measurement and also this issue of policy uptake. So the first observation is that more than 2/3 of OECD countries have developed national frameworks, development plans, or surveys with a multidimensional wellbeing focus. And you can see this activity started well before the OECD, so back in the early 2000s, but we've really seen an acceleration in the last 10 or 12 years in this activity. Again, these slides will be available. I know the text is small, but there's lots of detail there for people to have a look at. Another observation is that these dashboards come in quite different shapes and sizes. So in some countries, it's a very limited number of indicators. So in France, we've got the 10 new wealth indicators. There is a short set that Italy, the Ministry of Economy and Finance work with, but there is also a much longer set in Italy that you see down at the bottom of this slide, which is the data set produced by the National Statistical Office. So one of the reasons why some countries are mentioned several times on this slide is that, like New Zealand, the example we had earlier this morning, there are some countries where there are both policy-oriented initiatives, and these are shown in grey on this slide, and then there are measurement-oriented initiatives, usually led by statistical offices, which are in blue. Now, this is quite an old analysis. It would be really good for us to update this sometime soon. But the trend back when we did this is probably 2019, this slide dates to. The trend at that time tended to be that the policy initiatives would be focused on a more narrow set of indicators, so priorities here and now, whereas the data sets produced by statistical offices would be much more comprehensive monitoring frameworks, with the idea that, you know, you need to monitor a large number of outcomes to understand what it is you need to prioritize for policy. So there's also a very positive synergy between the policy work and the measurement work. But the onus on the measurement side is really to have a very comprehensive monitoring system so that you can spot the challenges as they emerge. If you only have 10 measures and you pick the wrong 10 measures, then you're not necessarily going to have that same ability to do the comprehensive monitoring. Final observation here is that many national initiatives share a common conceptual core. So if we look at the approaches taken in G7 countries on the left there, OECD countries at large in the middle, and also across international efforts, we do see at the dimension level, there is a lot of commonality. So if you like, the core ingredients of well-being are quite similar across these different initiatives. So just to explain this figure, there is a tick if the initiative has a measure that maps onto the dimensions shown on the OECD framework on the left-hand side. So if there is a measure that is in common with the OECD approach, there is a tick. You might notice here a few gaps. For example, knowledge and skills. This is partly a function of how we define knowledge and skills in the OECD approach. So we have a real focus on outcomes, what people know and can do, rather than measures of the education system or educational attainment, which we pick up to some extent in human capital. And you can see human capital down at the bottom there is covered in almost every framework. So it isn't that there isn't a focus on knowledge and skills. This is partly just how we define this in the OECD indicators that mean the overlaps are slightly fewer. Another example to point to here, France looks like it has fewer overlaps. This is largely a function of the fact that we're looking at the 10 new wealth indicators, and it is very hard for a set of 10 measures to cover 15 dimensions of well-being. So this is partly also a feature of the size of these different approaches as to how comprehensively they are monitoring the full framework. Last thing to emphasize is that very often inclusion and equal opportunities are addressed in a really cross-cutting manner. So they don't feature as a separate dimension of well-being, but rather in most cases, each outcome is examined in terms of both levels and in terms of inclusion. Finally, we are seeing some convergence at the indicator level in terms of how countries are approaching the measurement of well-being. The easiest measures at the moment to get the international data are, of course, those that are derived from national accounts and employment statistics. So those areas of economic well-being that have a very long history of international harmonization and standards. But the OECD has been trying to fill some of the data gaps in some of the more innovative areas of well-being, where there is maybe less consensus in how to approach the measurement. So even if all well-being frameworks recognize these as being important, not everybody is measuring these the same ways at the moment. So the OECD has been producing measurement guidelines to support the quality, consistency, and international comparability of data. I've got a few examples on this slide around subjective well-being and trust. We've also very recently issued a report on population measures of mental health. So how to measure mental health outcomes at the population level. And again, references can be made available. Apologies, it's not actually on this slide.
Sorry, we've got about 2 minutes left, if that's okay. Sorry, I didn't manage to warn you sooner.
Perfect, thanks, Eleanor. So I'll be very brief. I wanted to say a few words on the uptake of wellbeing evidence in policy, because I know that was a question for this session. Again, I will dive straight in and say that countries are employing many different methods and processes to apply a wellbeing approach in policy practice. And I've got some illustrations on the slide here. This comes from a report that we wrote recently. And again, there's a reference at the end of the slide, so you can go into the detail in your own time. But we're seeing, for example, wellbeing measures coming into play in terms of setting budgeting, also fiscal strategy. We're seeing wellbeing entering into performance frameworks and strategic coordination plans. We're seeing wellbeing used in policy appraisal and evaluation tools. And we're seeing a variety of embedding mechanisms. So whether that's legislation and accountability structures, or whether that's capacity building for civil servants, or indeed coordination bodies. One thing to say here is that there's no single way of using wellbeing evidence in policy. So at the moment, we're seeing lots of different experiments in different countries. And we think this is a real opportunity for knowledge sharing like we're having today, to look at those different approaches and what has worked and what has not worked. So if we take the example of budgeting, in some countries, this is more about the wellbeing monitoring and using that to feed the overall narrative or the strategy. In other cases, as we've heard from New Zealand, Canada, but also Italy, there are specific assessments of wellbeing impacts in the course of formulating budget initiatives, and also in terms of evaluating their impacts. So one last thing to say, however, is that a measurement framework on its own will not change policy. So you need a set of tools, a set of processes, and then a set of incentives if you really want to make a change in how decisions are made, informed by wellbeing evidence. And OECD in November of this year will be launching a knowledge exchange platform, where we hope that countries will come together and share examples of those incentives, those tools, and that evidence base that they are developing, with the hope of, again, identifying what works and where we need to go next. Last slide, just to say that if you want to know more about some of the things I've spoken about today, some of them are summarized in a report that we wrote quite recently. And again, links and slides will be available offline, but thanks very much for your time today.
Thanks very much, Carrie. And I'm going to quickly move over to our last presentation of the day, but as we say, last but not least. And we're heading over to Amit Yaga Kaul, and apologies if I've just said that incorrectly, who is the head of sector for wellbeing and sustainability indicators and cross-sectional statistical products at the Israeli Central Bureau of Statistics. And he'll be sharing with us the findings from the recent review he led on behalf of the UNECE on the measurement of well-being. So over to you.
Okay, thank you. Just to check, are you seeing my slides?
Yes, absolutely, seeing your slides.
Okay, great. So hello to everybody. I'm really very honored and very pleased to be here today with you and to briefly present our findings from the latest UNECE review of measurement of current well-being that we prepared together with Statistics Netherlands and with valuable contributions as well from Mexico and the OECD. And my name is Amit Yagur Kaul. I'm the head of Wellbeing, Sustainability and Cross-Sectional Statistics sector in the Israeli Central Bureau of Statistics. And I have actually been working on well-being indicators since we published our first set of indicators more than a decade ago. And I've witnessed the changes and developments in the fields over the years. So I was really very happy to, when I got the opportunity to take part in this review, and that set out to map the current status of measuring well-being in different countries in the UNECE region. Okay, so this review is part of a regular series of ongoing reviews conducted by the UNECE in selected statistical areas. These reviews set out to improve international statistical cooperation, to share information on best practices, and to address emerging issues and challenges. And the purpose of this review was to map current national experience on measuring current well-being, what we can refer to as the here and now. Based on extensive experience that has been accumulated, and you have heard about it also in other presentations on well-being in international and the national level, this review set out to learn about the current status of measurement, and especially we wanted to focus on national practices of measurement, the differences in measurement between countries, and the degree to which conceptual frameworks and international standards have been adopted within national measurement frameworks. Based on the commonly agreed definition, this review refers to well-being as a multidimensional concept covering almost all areas of human life, as you all know, and representing the ability of individuals, households, and societies to have their needs met and their goals fulfilled so that they can achieve a satisfactory quality of life throughout the different domains. Special issues that we wanted to focus on were the use of subjective measures, linking indicators to policy, the use of new data sources, and the use of composite indicators. Now, when you talk about well-being indicators, the issue of composite indicators versus scoreboard or single indicator is a constant debate, and it was interesting to get a sense of what is the actual situation in the measurement frameworks of different countries with respect to this issue. So the main component of this review was the country survey that was conducted. In 2022, we carried out a country survey to collect information on current practices of measurement. The survey included questions about whether or not countries measure well-being, first of all, which domains are measured, is there use of composite indicators, use of subjective indicators, measurement on the local level, reference to timeliness of data, is there use of any new data sources, what is the legal basis for measurement, what kind of policy use is there of the indicators, and more. We also requested feedback from the countries regarding the challenges they face and things that they would like to work on and improve in the future. So overall, 39 countries participated in the survey, most of them from the UNEC region, and 30 countries reported having a well-being measurement framework. And as you can see, the most common domains in use are income, health, and subjective well-being. So what are the main findings of the survey? Usually, well-being indicators are published on an annual basis referring to the previous year. Many countries base their frameworks on work done by Eurostat and the OECD, of course, How's Life, and the OECD guidelines for measuring subjective well-being. Subjective well-being, together with the income, is the most widely adopted domain, and some countries use only subjective measures in their measurement framework. And I will elaborate a little bit more on subjective indicators in the next slide. It was interesting to see that about a third of the countries reported having no policy use of the indicators or having no knowledge within the statistical office on whether or not the indicators are used for policy purposes. This may be the place to say that most of the respondents were naturally from statistical office. So this also tells us something about the relationships within countries between statistical offices and the policymakers. About 25% of the countries indicated the use of composite indicators in their well-being measurement framework, mostly in the domains of income, jobs, and health. And I will also elaborate on this a bit more in a minute. Another interesting finding, although we focused on current well-being, is that only a third of the countries reported having a measurement framework for future well-being, And it was also apparent that some countries were less familiar with the conceptual framework, such as the capital approach, for instance, that was presented earlier. Well, with regards to subjective well-being indicators, in the survey, countries were asked to indicate which 4 types of subjective well-being they measure. As you can see, the most common type was evaluative well-being, whereas eudaimonic indicators are least used subjective well-being measures. And there is also use of other subjective measures, such as indicators of trust or expectations for the future and things like that. And with regards to composite indicators, when we look at the situation regarding the use of composite indicators, we see that 8 countries reported using composite indicators, and the most common domains were those of income, jobs, and health and education. And half of the countries reported also applying an equal weight method, and half of them have a differential weight method. But still, from the results of this survey, there is further work that needs to be done in learning about the different weighing method. There's not enough information from this survey regarding this issue. So the challenges that were raised in the survey by the countries concerned improving the ability to make international comparisons through harmonizing concept and terminologies. Capacity building related to development of composite indicator was an interest, strengthening the reliability of subjective measures, improving timeliness, exploring new data sources, and strengthening the communication aspect of well-being indicators, which is most relevant when we talk about linking well-being indicators to policy. So based on this review and the result of the survey, we recommended establishing a task force to develop guidelines for the measurement of well-being to support countries that produce or consider producing well-being indicators. And at this point, it's really important to stress what these guidelines are not meant to do. The purpose is not to develop a new measurement framework, but to create common practical guidelines based on existing knowledge. And I remember something that I heard, I think, in one of the previous sprints. We don't want to invent the wheel again, but we really aim at practical guidelines. So the main mission of this task force would be to focus on developing common practical guidelines for national measurement frameworks. As of today, not like the case of measuring GDP, for instance, we are here beyond GDP. Countries are still at different levels of maturity with regards to measuring well-being. And even countries that have a developed framework are not always necessarily aligned with international standards. So the guidelines could address issues such as defining core domains, core indicators, harmonization of methodology, for instance, harmonizing survey questions that are relevant for core well-being indicators, suggestions for composite indicators, and taking into consideration that we are not necessarily speaking about an overall one well-being index. Guidelines for improving timeliness and for using new data sources, how to analyze and present inequalities, how to analyze indicators, interactions between indicators and domains, and between well-being indicators and sustainability indicators, and more. And of course, we mean to do all this in cooperation with all other current work that is being done to prevent any potential duplications or contradictions in international work, so we could be we can eventually create one unified international message. So we just launched the work of the task force a week ago, And the plan is to present the final recommendation report by the middle of 2025. We are also planning to have a seminar in June 2024 to discuss the first draft and for presenting best practices in different issues that could serve as benchmarks for the guidelines. So we will most likely be reaching out to members of this forum to take an active part in our future work, and I hope we will all benefit from the outcomes of this work. And that's it from me. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very, very much. So we do now have some time for questions, about 10 to 15 minutes, and the chat bar has been pinging away quite nicely during our conversation, during your presentations. So one I know that is in conversation, but I'm going to raise it here as well so the speakers can be brought in, was the OECD, like UNEP, the World Bank and IMF, uses the term capital as an overarching concept for key dimensions relevant for future well-being. Is the productive instrumental view, which this term conveys, and all that comes with it, not a regressive conceptual step with respect to the very idea of going beyond GDP, embedded in well-being and quality of life dashboards, as well as SDGs and multidimensional frameworks? It also very much related to the attempt to monetize all values. I'm going to skim over a little bit because it's a long question. So do our speakers agree that there is an implicit competition between different sub-communities of the official statistics world, with the most traditional economists trying to keep supremacy of GDP-like aggregates through the alchemies of capital approach? Very big question. Whoever would like to answer that first, please feel free.
I feel some obligation to answer because I flashed up our framework, which indeed uses the language of capitals. And I think I would say one of the challenges in wellbeing is that we are trying to bridge multiple communities. So it is a multidimensional approach. It must be a multidisciplinary approach. You know, if you're going to do a good job of measuring these different aspects of people's well-being, you really need to have a multidisciplinary team. And I think, you know, we've come up against challenges with the use of capital, because for some economists that we work with, actually, they will say, you're not really measuring capital. You know, your measures, which we do not monetize except for economic capital, because we're using the outputs of the National Accounts Framework for economic capital. For our other measures of capital, we are not monetizing. The idea is not looking at how these combine to produce economic growth. We are looking at how these combine to produce well-being. And when I say combine to produce well-being, that's kind of economist language for making life better. And I think that is the ultimate goal that people can unite around. We need to tidy up the language, strengthen the language so that it's language that all communities and all disciplines can feel represented by. And maybe capitals is a barrier. And I know it's halfway in the middle of the night in New Zealand, so we can't hear from our New Zealand colleagues. But I know that they have used the language of wealth, which is one that we've also seen in France, for example, to get away from this narrow sort of economic definition of capital towards a much broader sense of the wealth of our societies, the wealth of our communities. So maybe that's something we should reflect on in our own framework.
Fab, thanks, Carrie. Amit, go on.
Yeah, maybe I could just add, first of all, I can now speak from my national experience. We also had to deal with this language issue of speaking about capital, and we found that it was easier sometimes to speak about resources. So instead of capital, we were talking about resources, in cultural aspects, human, social, and so on. But when we, as I mentioned, our review dealt only with the current well-being, but certainly the connection to sustainability is really important, and the language that is needed to create some kind of a common terminology for this concept is really crucial. Yeah.
I think you've hit on a really valuable point. and not to steal some of the notes that I was going to say, just to sum us all up. But I think one of the key issues that we have in this space is communication and language, and the fact that yes, we do use different terms to cover the same things, but also in having wellbeing frameworks cover so many disciplines and trying to bring so many professions with us and cross-sector professions, the language element is the one that's going to be the hardest, I think, for us to grasp, and to meet the communication needs of all those groups is, I personally think, is a challenge. And in the UK is one that I would say I'm currently grappling with. And I did note as you were talking, maybe we should change our own use of capitals to resources, and whether that would help us in that space as well. But that is certainly, I think, something that is a really important thing to raise. I'm going to have one more question, maybe two, and then I'll sum us up to make sure that we end on time. So we have a question from Evo, which is, are cross-border well-being measures considered, sometimes referred to as well-being elsewhere? For instance, is my well-being affected by well-being in other countries?
Just once again, I just want to say once again that we dealt in this current review only with current well-being, the here and now. But of course, this is I think this is the area of well-being measurement that we have less dealt with, and also most frameworks deal with the least. So yeah, there's still a lot of work to be done in this field.
Okay, Carrie, would you like to come in?
Sure.
Yeah,
I pop some. Oh, you go ahead. You, Carrie.
You had your hand up. You're following protocol. You go first.
Okay. Excuse me. I have some brief thoughts in the chat on this, but just from Canada's perspective, like our quality of life framework is really domestic in focus, and I think that's one of the lines between our participation in the global SDG and common agenda and our domestic quality of life framework. So there's a lot of relationships between those, but in terms of the scope differences between those two activities, that's where I would see that. But it is it's a pertinent question and an interesting one.
And like in Canada, the OECD approach is also tending to focus on what's happening at the national level. So it's a country comparative tool, which means that it is quite domestically focused. We have experimented with this, and we have a working paper on what we've called transboundary measures, which are trying to look at indicators that enable us to capture transboundary flows and impacts across countries. So we have experimented in this space, and I think there are aspects of our framework where you simply cannot get away from the fact that we live on one planet and we're all sharing natural resources. So I think particularly in the area of natural capital, it is very hard for us to think in purely national terms. So I agree, this is an important frontier. It's an important kind of conceptual and foundational aspect of trying to capture well-being. It's not one at the moment that is very well materialized in indicator form in particular. And there's a lot of work to be done to build international consensus around a set of indicators that could do that job. But conceptually, it's central, and we need to do a better job.
Fab, thank you. We have another hand up, so would you like to come in?
Hi, my name is Övünç Uysal. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. I just wanted to inform you about a measure, about an indicator Carrie just raised on. This is probably many of you heard before, but it's on its development phase. EEA that I'm currently working in has some publications. JRC has some publications on consumption footprint, which you are measuring and the environmental impact of a consumption that you have in one country, and you connect its environmental impacts on any other regions in the rest of the world. So I think this indicator with the comparison of production footprint and its discrepancies will provide a very good well-being elsewhere effect, and it will be very much complementary to the Eurostat's spillover effects in their EU SDGs publication. Just wanted to chip in. Thank you.
Fab, thank you. Are there any more questions before we start to wrap up? I'm just quickly scrolling back through the chat to see if I missed anything. If anyone wants to come in, please just raise your hand in case I have. Okay, I think I've given, no, Ivo, you coming in with a question?
Yeah, coming in with a lot, but just and thank you all for this great presentation. I think they were very insightful. I'm following this field continuously, but I learned again a lot. So thank you all for this. This is really wonderful. And it feeds nicely in our work of the network and that's where the question basically comes to is I totally understand that the discussions are about national and domestic sort of discussions around quality of life, well-being dashboards, and also the OECD is doing a great job in bringing that all together and getting an understanding of commonality and consistency and terminology, which I think is a very important role, as well as the UNECE. Amit, I must say that you're becoming part of it. The network is also pursuing that. But my point is, I don't hear yet. Although I think Carrie, and this is the Carrie from StatsCan, you mentioned you have the SDG work, which is international, and you have your own work carved out in Canada, and there seemed to be not a sort of demand to link the two processes. So for me, it would be more for the national statistical, the national practices. Can we try to link them more to get a better understanding in carving out, a trajectory towards more sort of a limited number of headline indicators that are internationally comparable. And I think if we don't bring that in, as you do your discussion with policymakers and budgets, we do not get an idea of whether they look at that international comparability. And I'm not so much thinking, although I think it's you and I are pointing out, there's a new frontier in measuring welfare elsewhere, or well-being elsewhere. So just my question is, how do we want it first? And if we want it, how do you do it to bring it more in the national processes? Thank you.
Harry, I don't know if you want to come in on this one, or I'm happy from a NSI perspective as well, with our own SDG reporting. And it's something that working with Amit on the starting to work with Amit on the guidelines, my role supporting this group as well, but also being responsible domestically for our national reporting measures is something I've been given an awful lot of thought to, and it's a challenging one. And I think many different countries are in different positions domestically about their use within their policy departments as well, and what's being asked of them for policy departments and the demands of the data, and try and ratify that against international demands is challenging at times. But one of the things I think is that we can take it down to its simplistic levels, and even within our domestic settings, many of the measures that we have within that are internationally comparable. So, for example, unemployment statistics, or for example, because of the OECD subjective wellbeing measures, our subjective wellbeing measures are comparable across a great number of areas. So within our frameworks, I bet we'd all be quite surprised, or maybe not surprised, how many measures that we can filter our domestic dashboards down to, that either we can have what's the most timely measures, what's the most granular, and which ones are internationally comparable. And we could probably filter our domestic dashboards down into those sets already to allow us to have some of those conversations. One of the things that I'm personally grappling with the most is that level between having what's domestically important, and I highlighted a lot through our presentation the importance of voice and measuring what matters most to us in the UK so we can understand what the drivers are for our domestic populations. Now, how you then mark that against the international standards and things like SDGs, which have to cover the whole of the world in many ways, and making sure that we have metrics under domains such as health that are relevant both to the challenges faced in, say, the UK, but also faced in areas like sub-Saharan Africa. And we might want to consider that across the whole. So one of the things that I'm wondering is whether we need to be more mindful not of the exact metric, but maybe of the domains that we consider to be the most important. So whether we have to be covering health, for example, we know that's something that matters, and we have to be covering access to services, but is access to services in one area access to safe water, for example, but in another area access to services might be access to a leisure centre so that you can undertake physical exercise, and it might just mean different things in different concepts, and we accept those differences. But this isn't a fully formed thought. These are all the thoughts that are rolling through my head, rightly or wrongly. And I know we've got 4 minutes left, but if anyone else wants to come in on that, please feel free. We have silence. Absolute silence. Okay. Ivo, is your hand up a legacy hand, or is there anything else you wanted to come back in on?
No, it's a legacy hand, but thank you. You worded it well. Probably, sorry, put my camera. Probably we have to think about maybe higher order sort of dimensions, and then leave the specifications to the countries themselves at the domestic level. Although give cue to what that could be for international comparability, so we could still, get a sense of convergence, as we will, for an international sort of comparability. Yeah. No, thank you. Well spoken, Eleanor. Well done. Thank you.
Fab. With 1 more minute then, and I see Rich has come back on the screen, and I'll give him the privilege of wrapping us up to an end. I just wanted to thank everyone for their contributions today. That's both the presenters and all the participants for their really interesting questions, and recognising that for some of you it's very late in the evening, and for some of you it's very, very early in the morning. So thank you for stretching your day for us on both sides of the world, for you to be here. I had some other reflections I was going to share, but I think I've covered them quite a lot in those last few questions. So again, I'll just say thank you very much, and I'll hand over to Richard.
Thank you, and thank you everybody. It's always good one of these sprints to see so many people sticking out to the end. It shows a lot of interest, and I think the presentations entirely deserve that interest. They were absolutely fascinating and really well put together. So thank you everyone who's presented. I think obviously from the task team's point of view, we will be writing up a summary of this session. And I think there's a lot of really interesting work here that we need to think about, making sure we find ways of joining the dots and sharing the information that we have. So Amit mentioned the UNECE task team. I can see a lot of value in us sharing the materials we've been able to gather today, and thinking about how we work together in the future. And so I know Eleanor works with you on that, and we'll be striving to do that. And similarly, I think we saw there an awful lot of not just really interesting examples, but also areas of best practice and of guidance. The materials that Carrie mentioned from the OECD, I know I'll be having a good look at. But mostly, I just want to say a really big thank you to everyone who's been with us today, and to give you a quick plug for our next session, which is at the same time on the 14th of September, this time next week, when Ivo and Tim Miller from the UN DESA will be taking us through the range of different distributional models which are currently out there to look at what I think we all consider to be a really key aspect of considering well-being, how we address and think about and measure inequalities and distributional aspects of the work that we're studying. Thank you very, very much. I hope to see as many of you next week as we can. do please keep the dialogue open. If you have further questions that come to you, do please use the network's email to send them in to us. And we look forward to seeing you next week. Have a good rest of your day and see you all soon. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you all.